And now to a special excerpt this afternoon. It is often said people without knowledge of their history, origin and culture are like tree without roots. This phrase rings true to the Kuria community in the wake of the alarming destruction of Jintora and Indigenous tree, which for decades has been considered sacred in the community. Our reporter Sarafina Robi was in the village, one of the villages in Kuria West, and brought us details of how culture and tradition played a key role in the conservation of indigenous trees, a culture that is fast fading as globalization takes roots, threatening to wipe out the Jintora tree along with the cultural practices associated with it.
Tucked at the border of Kenya and Tanzania is a hidden tale of sacred trees, traditionally known as Gitontira. These indigenous trees have for generations remained a cultural pride for the Kuria community when conducting a ceremony considered sacred known as Isubo.
These are traditions where old traditional men would go around an indigenous tree, performing certain rites to prolong their lineage and prosperity. And thereafter, that tree would never be cut down. If cut down, it would destroy their lineage and bring misfortunes. And this is because there were lots of traditional medicine that was put around the tree during the Isubo ceremony.
A walk through certain villages reveals a few left indigenous trees, the sights and sound of nature welcoming. But what is the story behind the native Gitontira tree that is currently facing extinction? We seek out to 86-year-old Andrew Maramwita.
There are seasons when it would produce fruits. Back then, our ancestors, such as Mzee Kirigiti, used to say that things said and treasured by traditional leaders stood the test of time and should be preserved.
Mwita gives us details to a T on how the Isubo ceremony was conducted at the base of a tree, down to the chants that characterized the ceremony. He reminisces with pride how the sacred rituals were conducted by elderly persons back in the day, complete with the misfortunes that were believed to befall anyone who dared to cut the tree.
When one wanted to do the Isubo ceremony around the indigenous tree, he had to do it with his first wife, even if he had 10 of them. Only had one wife called Nyagetende.
You cut any tree, you'll be recorded to go with a goat and slaughter there.
He shows us one of the sacred trees, which he says was used for the Isubo ceremony by an elderly man in the community known as Ndera Umarwa wa Ndera back in 1976.
One would sleep in the cattle shed facing the sky and stars all night before the day of the ceremony, as his age mates and visitors from all walks of life ate and drank. It was a big ceremony where cows would be slaughtered. Young men would dance with young women as the Kuria traditional songs were sung.
A few meters away, we are shown another spot where a similar tree was preserved by a man called Mwita Nyabogongwe in 1972.
Areas around such trees were never cultivated. It's only recently that people cut down such trees and even farm. People are crazy. They have gone mad.
But what type of trees were considered for such traditions?
Especially trees that normally, if you cut it, you find some milk dripping. So those trees were regarded to be very solemn, and they were also used to carry out cultural ceremonies.
However, this rich history sounds foreign to 24-year-old Emmanuel Moserega Jomo.
Watu siku hizi mambo imebadilika. Watu sahi wanafanya vitu zao, wanafanya ile kitu yeye anaelewa. So hata akikuja akate hapo mtu kimwambia kwamba ni ya wale wazee wa kitambo anasema hapana.
Women too played a role in the preservation of the trees.
We can't fetch firewood from such cultural indigenous trees because that is where our ancestors did their traditional ceremonies.
According to 37-year-old Christine Wangengi, there are specific trees that women were not allowed to cut for firewood.
It was believed that if a lady fetched firewood from indigenous trees that had tendrils and roots around, called imerembera, they would give birth to twisted babies with tendrils. So was the same to a certain tree called omosasa, which will have you quarreling with your husband and you would know no peace.
But all these cultural efforts to preserve the indigenous trees appear to be at risk. 78-year-old Sibora Gabosi Mwita narrates how one of the sacred trees was felled.
It was felt to go dry tobacco because it had lots of branches. When cutting it down, they slaughtered a sheep and threw the intestines around it while performing certain sacred rites.
Josephat Nyakega Turuka, a teacher, attributes the destruction of indigenous trees such as Gitontira to tobacco drying among locals.
You don't tell them that they respect the trees, they will ask you many questions. And if you tell them that you will die, they want to see how they will die.
Similar sentiments were shared by the assistant chief, Joseph Mwitarobi, who says besides tobacco farming, gold mining is also a major contributor to felling of indigenous trees.
To support the mining pits, they have found that these trees are very strong. They withstand any pressure, the water. Once in the water, they don't rot.
Whereas the locals are in agreement, preservation of culture and indigenous trees is important. It's not lost on them that religion and modernization has contributed to the fast fading cultural practices.
So those ones who are seriously subscribers of Christianity, they tended to associate those norms as sorcery and backward. Therefore, they don't want to value them and they don't want to copy them. But they had nothing to do with the evil way. That is how they were to preserve their life.
What has destroyed the tradition of protecting such trees is religion. I'm also a Christian, so I'm not attacking it. But they should not attack it and interfere with our traditions, just as we do not interfere with their religion.
And as the world battles environmental changes largely associated with deforestation, the threat of extinction of indigenous trees is real.
Within this locality, there won't be more than 50. Yeah, there are not many.
The forefathers of the Kuria community had coined a way to preserve the indigenous trees. Whereas their methods may not fly in today's reality, it begs the question, what next for indigenous trees like the Gitontira? And most importantly, how best can communities promote afforestation of indigenous trees, preserve their culture and tradition to debunk the statement that people without history, origin and culture are like a tree without roots? Since time immemorial, cultures have been used to shape up forest. But as time goes by, some of these cultures are fading, and so are the cultural forests. The clarion call by most tribal leaders is that the government will now put up laws to protect what is considered as a cultural heritage by most of these tribes against the backdrop of climate change. Sarafina Robi for KBC Channel 1 from Kurutiange, Kuria West, Migori County.